Hello, everyone, and welcome to our homecoming lecture this morning. My name is Zuan, and I am a fourth year completing my undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering. I am also a campus ambassador for UC Berkeley. First, I would like to extend a huge thank you to all of our donors. We all benefit from and are immensely grateful for generations of your support. And thank you all for joining us today. Before we begin, here are some important housekeeping notes. Please note that we are recording this event and we are keeping the audience muted to minimize background noise. Please use the chat feature to pose any questions you have for our speakers. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Chair of the Japanese American Women Alumni of UC Berkeley, Grace Morizawa.
Thank you, Zion. Welcome, everybody. So great to see you. On behalf of the Japanese American Women Alumni of UC Berkeley, if there are any students out there, I want to extend a special welcome to you. It's great to see the campus alive. As a Berkeley resident, your energy and spirit uplift us and give us hope for these difficult times. So welcome. Hope you're having fun at Cal. My name is Grace Morizawa, and I'm the board chair for the Japanese American Women Alumni of UC Berkeley, a charter club since 1992, but our roots go back further than that. In the 1920s and 30s, Japanese American students could not find housing due to racism. In the fall of 1937, after 10 years of fundraising, the Japanese American Women's Student Clubhouse opened on Hearst. And I put it up on my virtual screen so you could kind of get an idea of what it's like. Years later, with the sale of this house in the 70s, our founding alumni were able to create an endowment for scholarship awards. Since 1970, we have granted awards to over 160 women undergraduate students and 60 graduate students. Last year, our total amount of for the awardees was $46,000. It is this legacy of action, community, and generosity that leads us to today's conversation. And let me introduce our speakers. We're so honored to have Chizu Omori, caught in the bamboo forest here. She will be in conversation with Vice Chair Stacy Kono. They'll talk about people, organization, and movements that have inspired Chizu's lifelong activism over the years, which continues today in support of immigrant rights and the Black reparation movement. Chizu is a mother, grandmother, activist, award-winning documentary producer, and writer, whose story was featured in Oprah magazine in November 2020. Our organization awarded her its 2021 Outstanding Alumni Award because of her strong commitment to civil and human rights, which was fostered by her experiences as a student at UC Berkeley during the 50s civil rights movement. In conversation with her will be Stacy Kono, who graduated from Cal with a degree in Women's Studies. She is currently the executive director at Hand in Hand, the Domestic Employees Network, a national nonprofit that is working to bring respect and dignity to domestic workers and increase access to care at home. Stacy joined JAWA board because she's interested in being part of an intergenerational community of women leaders to support the next generation and uplift our community's history at UC and beyond. So, welcome Chizu and welcome Stacy.
Thank you, Grace. Hi all, I'm Stacy Kono, and I'm really excited, Chizu, that you and I get to have this conversation. we've kind of designed this program so that Chizu and I will just be chatting, and you'll get the wonderful benefit of hearing about all of the work that Chizu's engaged in. So we wanted to just start out though, Chizu, right? We talked a little bit about you just sharing your experience growing up. You were the first generation in your family to go to college, and you grew up on a farm in the 1930s. What were some of the expectations your parents had of you?
Well, I attribute the fact that my family had no boys at the time to being allowed to go to college, because in those days, the boys were favored over girls to, do things like go to college. And I do remember that, like some family friends saying, why do you need to go to college? You're not going to do anything but, like get married or something and raise a family. And so the community, the Japanese community, had this bias against women, needing an education or anything. So, but my father, I was lucky in having a father who was, a more laid back kind of person. And since I wanted to go to college, he didn't object. And I went to 2 years UCLA and 2 years, or I went on to Berkeley and graduated there. Yeah.
That's great.
But I really should go back and say, I grew up in the 30s. I'm going to announce that I'm 91 years old. So if you can possibly imagine going back that far, at any rate, it was a very different world, a world before World War II. And the farm that we grew up on was really I had this dual culture upbringing because it was very Japanese in a lot of ways. My mother never learned to speak English, and so Japanese was spoken in the home, and I didn't learn English until I started school. So so that I also went to Japanese school an hour every day after American school, so that I was really being, given this dual culture upbringing. Anyway, and I realized, that we were not urban people, and therefore, a lot less sophisticated about what was going on. And it's like when the war broke out, I was just a little kid. I was 11, and when they rounded up all of the Japanese Americans and put us into incarceration camps, it came as a shock to me personally, I guess, because I didn't understand what it was about. In fact, I think most of us didn't quite understand what it was about. It just seemed a kind of surreal experience to have to go through. And I had never thought of myself as being, anything other than American, that I was never teased or bullied or anything. And so
Yeah,
I did not feel, I didn't understand what was happening to us.
yeah.
I
My
really
parents shared the same sort of experience with me as well.
Mhm.
They both were their families were both incarcerated at Tule Lake and in very, very Northern California. And as a young person learning from my parents about their experience, it was so confusing to me. My dad told this really sad story of, when they left for camp, they had to leave their dog behind. His name was Brownie Cowboy. And they were in the truck driving away, and the dog was running after them in the dust, trying to catch up. And he just, he was very young at the time, so he too didn't really understand. But both of my parents' families really felt we've been patriotic to the United States. How can this happen? And
Yes.
120,000 other people, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
Who lost their homes and were off the West Coast and were taken. I wonder if you could tell us more about what camp was like for you and your family.
Yeah. Well, we went to a camp called Poston, Arizona. And it was one of 10 major camps where the people were distributed. And, you know, it just was a completely different, you know, like being cast from one world into another, in that the camps were rows of barracks and it was very primitive, and life was kind of regimented in the fact that we had to eat our meals three times a day in mess halls, and the you know, our barracks were very spare and very ill built so that the elements could come in easily. It was very dirty and dusty, and the Arizona weather was like 115 in the summers. And well, anyway, it was not pleasant. And everybody really had to scramble around to make life kind of livable under those conditions. But children are children, so you know, activities were organized for us. So we, you know, we had schools, and we had Girl Scouts, and we had social activities and church and sports, and all that stuff got fairly quickly organized because people had time on their hands. I mean, suddenly they were removed from jobs, from usually, you know, the housewifey kinds of things that you did, because you didn't have to cook and you didn't have to, and we just had one room. So it wasn't like we had a lot of cleaning to do, except for the dust, the perpetual dust. So that I'd say that our community, you know, began to organize itself quite quickly. And so as children, you know, we had a lot of spare time and making a lot of friends in camp. It was the first time that I had ever been with nothing but other Japanese Americans. And that was a shock to me, because mostly when going to school, I was just one of a small handful in the school. And so that was culture shock. Also, coming from a farm and mixing with all these city people and all that, you know, I mean, for me, all of that was new and different. And so I think it's just, I was absorbing a lot as a kid, and also, you know, early adolescence and all that. So anyway, I was not thinking, like, I like to characterize it as the little picture and the big picture. The little picture is yourself, your family, and the immediate camp that you're in. Okay, I had no idea that there were 10 other big camps, or what had happened to other people or anything, because communication was, you know, cut off pretty much, because, you know, they would not allow us to take in any radios or anything of that type. So I think for a while, it was like we were really isolated. And the big picture is the whole, well, they call it internment. There's a controversy over that, but the whole, why did the government do this to us sort of thing, which is something that I didn't really know about until I was, you know, pretty old, you know, pretty late, beyond adolescence and all that. So that I've spent a lot of time examining and learning about the big picture, because the more I knew about it, the more awful it became. So I've concentrated a lot part of my life in trying to learn about it and to understand it, and looking at it as something that happened to a whole community. Individually, yes, we all have our individual stories depending on our circumstances, but the big picture was really an American story, and like, how did this happen here in America?
Yeah. And you and your sister actually worked on a documentary called Rabbit in the Moon that really tells more of that big picture story, right? Of the ways in which, even though my parents and you were little and enjoying the freedom of being at quote unquote camp, when Japanese Americans talk about camp, we know that it was actually an experience of being of being taken away from our homes, being divided as a community.
Yeah.
Could you say a little bit more about the story you were trying to tell in that big picture for Rabbit in the Moon?
Well, you know, once my sister and I started getting into it, I'm thinking there's material here for like a 10-part series because it's very complicated, involving a lot of, you know, moving parts and everything else. We had to boil it down to just one documentary.
Yeah.
But I realized, you know, that one generation's work and lives were wiped out. I'm talking about the immigrant generation, who had painfully built up, you know, a life in the United States. They pretty much lost everything. The subsequent generations were younger, so they could kind of recover in coming out of the camps. But I would say our grandparents' generation really were severely affected. And there were intergenerational conflicts during the whole camp experience, because I would say there were younger people who felt that their loyalties were towards America, that we had to prove that we were loyal and, you know, worthy of American citizenship and worthy of being Americans. And that went counter to many of the older people who were enraged and embittered by this thing that had happened to them, you know, and they had very little recourse, because until about 1952, no Japanese were allowed to naturalize as citizens, and they were very restricted in their economic lives and what they could own and what you know, what they could do, where they could live, and all that sort of thing. So for that generation, it was a total loss. And on top of all that, the government imposed a loyalty divide in our country through the means, this is very crude, you know, it's a lot more complicated, but they imposed a questionnaire on everybody over the age of 17. And this was mandatory. And through the use of this questionnaire, they divided the community into loyal and disloyal. And that's been a difficult thing in our, you know, even to today, there's divisions because of that government policy, which is very cruel and very divisive, and you know, it impacted our community in ways that you know, I won't go into, but
that have lasted through today and been passed on to other generations. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think about my parents and our larger community's experience with the incarceration during World War II. And I realize and appreciate how my parents raised me to be both very proud of my identity and culture, but also to really understand social injustice, that social injustice our community faced pre-war, the racism that Japanese Americans and Japanese folks of Japanese ancestry faced, but also
just Asians, you might say, you
and
know, Asians,
people of color in the country.
The Chinese, you know, gee, they were here a little earlier, and I think in some ways, you know, they suffered more.
Yeah,
you want to put it that way, but
yeah,
anyway, just Asians in general. Yeah, today there's anti-Asian, you know, problems today. So
absolutely,
this is very ongoing.
Yeah. For me, though, I guess maybe the silver lining of that injustice was that it really motivated me to come to Cal because of the free speech movement and the activism here, the Third World Liberation Front, that it really attracted me. And while I was at Cal, I got involved in a lot of different student activism around immigrant rights, around workers' rights. I wonder if you could talk about your, since it's homecoming, your experience at Cal and how Cal influenced your political development.
Yeah, well, you know, in high school, in Los Angeles, I ran around with a group of very bright Jewish girls, and they were so politically hip. They were very progressive and left-wing. So that was my first major influence. And also one of my very good close friends was a writer named Hisae Yamamoto. Now, some of you may know her, but she was a very good friend of mine. And she wanted me to become a writer. And so I was kind of pushed that way. I was an English major and everything. But at a certain point, I just decided, I don't want to be a writer. That just means being stuck in front of a typewriter, for, sort of very isolated, and that isn't the life I wanted. So when I came to Cal, boy, for somebody who's interested in progressive ideas, this was really ideal. I mean, I look back on my life at Cal as a tremendous education in many, many ways. And at that time, the major civil rights issues were McCarthyism, and there was the loyalty questionnaire on our campus on Berkeley. The faculty was being asked to sign a loyalty oath or something like that. Anyway, I got involved in a group called Student Civil Liberties Union, which is an offshoot of ACLU. And so I remember one interesting thing, going to an ACLU meeting in San Francisco led by Ernest Bessig. And then the people in my car were Alexander Michael John and somebody else. And these people had connections with the camp experience. And yet at that time, I just, I didn't know, so I didn't make that connection. But later on, I learned that Ernest Bessig was a huge activist who supported us and, went to great lengths to try to, well, he's involved in the Korematsu case and, going to Tule Lake and all those things. And so we owe a debt of gratitude for Ernest Bessig and also Wayne Collins of the ACLU in San Francisco. But anyway, so that's kind of like the way I got interested in civil rights is through McCarthyism, really. And then, I was here living in Berkeley during the Black civil rights movements in the 60s, the anti-Vietnam War stuff, and feminism and all that. And so I don't consider myself as, an active leader, but I just, immerse myself in all of these movements that were going on in and around the Bay Area, you might say, And then I moved to Seattle, and that's where I got involved in the redress and reparations movement for Japanese Americans. And that to me was a big change in my life, that my, instead of broad civil rights, became focused on a demand for an apology for our camp experience. And so it's because I was involved in all that, including a lawsuit that went up to the Supreme Court, William Horry, the class action lawsuit. And I was a member of the class, so to speak, about 20 names. So I got to go and sit in front of the Supreme Court hearing our case. So anyway,
Will you say a little more about what the case was about?
Well, it was challenging the government for violating so many parts of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and things like that. I don't know, it was 11 counts or something like that. Yeah. The thing is, we were asking for big money rewards, and it would have been something like $150,000 per person, or something like that. Anyway, so it was considered moot when Congress passed the legislation that granted an apology and reparations of $20,000 per living persons who are still alive at the time they signed the legislation, who had endured the camp experience. So during that, I joined the redress movement, not because I thought we would win. I thought that America just does not know enough about what happened to us. And so it was an educational move as far as I was concerned. And the fact that it won was almost like a big surprise. Imagine that, you know, getting heard at the Supreme Court and having our bills passed in Congress through a series of commission hearings in which finally the government asked us what happened to us, and people were allowed to tell about their experience during the camp. And that was a major change for our community because we'd been really pushed into silence over the experience. You know, you couldn't just tell people like, well, I spent World War II in a concentration camp in the United States. You know, it just was not something that people brought up. And so it just was, you know, in fact, I remember a reporter saying, oh, I can't believe that, you know, is that really true? And so it, you know, denial, the government really, I think, didn't want it known very widely. And even today, I would say that there are a lot of people who still know nothing or very little about this government policy of incarcerating a whole ethnic group like they did.
Yeah. I mean, I'm so grateful to you and to everyone, all the Japanese Americans who are willing to share their story for that educational purpose, because I don't think I wouldn't have learned it in school if my parents hadn't encouraged me to explore it further and to be more involved in the community. You and I actually reconnected many years ago. Maybe it's not many, maybe like 3 years, 2-3 years ago, when there was a group, you were part of the group organizing a pilgrimage to Crystal City, Texas.
I got to stand up and show you. I'm wearing my
Super
Solidarity t-shirt.
Anyway, an organization suited for solidarity. Yeah. And Crystal City, for folks that don't know, is what there was a justice, Department of Justice camp there. So in addition, there are 10 camps that Japanese Americans were incarcerated at, but there were also a number of smaller justice camps. Many,
like 50 or 60. Or even more, maybe. Yeah.
And Grace was there too with us at the pilgrimage.
Yeah, right.
And so in addition to sort of reconvening at the site of this historic injustice in Crystal City, we also gathered to protest immigrant family separations at a detention center nearby. And it was just so powerful to see how history was repeating itself again, and how we as Japanese Americans saw that connection because of all of you who've shared stories about it. I'm wondering if you could tell me and all of us more about your activism today and how you've connected your social justice and civil rights work at UC Berkeley, the continued work around redress and reparations, to the issues that are happening today.
Well, we have a basic problem in our country. I mean, we pride ourselves on being very democratic and progressive and multicultural, multiracial and all that. And yet there is a large part of American society that feels threatened by the rise, you might say, or the numbers really, of non-white people in this country. And I think this is a basic issue which is at the core of what's happening in our politics right now. And so that anyway, I'm for diversity and a multiracial, multicultural culture. And so I'm going to fight for this because otherwise, we are going to be an extremely polarized, divided nation. And so what can I say? I feel involved because I am who I am. And I'm fighting for certain democratic ideals, you might say. And you know, it's important for me and my family, for the growing up generations, that we form a diverse society and a multicultural America.
Yeah. And Grace, in your introduction, talked about your work around Black reparations and immigrant rights. And you show your T-shirt with Suru for Solidarity. What are some of the why are you involved in that work?
Well, you know, I've come to look on the incarceration of Japanese Americans as just another instance of, say, non-white America's history in the United States, that we are, you know, considering slavery and the treatment of Native Americans and also brown Americans, all the people from Mexico and south of the border, you might say, and us Asians from the East, that, oh, what's my point here? What was the question, Stacy? Yeah. Oh, my involvement, you mean?
Yeah, why
Black
why?
reparations.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Right.
How you see
yeah,
what's
yeah.
the connection?
Yeah. So that really, you know, America owes its, which I say, economic prosperity to a large degree, you know, due to slave labor and just exploitation of non-white peoples, pretty much. And I think, you know, we need to acknowledge that. And well, the Black history is really terrible, you know. And so the more I know about it, the more I feel that, yes, that is our history. I claim it as American history. That is my history. So I feel obligated that we as Americans need to acknowledge what was done to Black Americans, and that well, I don't know what form it will take, but at least with HR 40, which is the bill which is in Congress right now, it's patterned after the Japanese American bills in Congress, which call for a commission, you know, to have people tell their stories. And I think the HR 40 is also commission oriented, that is to examine the facts, to have people come forward and tell their stories, and so that we learn about our past, that we're not going to pretend like that didn't happen, or that or we had nothing to do with it or something. So I feel that the commission way is one way of approaching reparations.
Yeah, and I mean, just thinking about how that for Japanese American redress and reparations, the stories, like you said, were so just as powerful as winning the actual passage of the legislation and the education piece, so that future generations are aware, and we can actually heal so many of the racial injustices and wounds in this nation.
Well, I just want to mention that. So my sister and I made this documentary about our experiences and about you know, camp experience in general, and it's old. It came out in 1999, but you can access it through Canopy. Everybody knows what Canopy is. Yeah, the library will have it. So anyway, if you
and that's Rabbit in the Moon too, or is that a different Rabbit in the Moon? Okay, great. Well, I know we're coming up on questions and answers. So maybe what we could end on, Chizu, is, since this is homecoming and we're really excited to have the Berkeley community here with us, parents and students and alumni, if there's a message that you would offer as a longtime activist and alum to our audience of Cal Bears.
Well, I don't know. You know, I don't consider myself a leader or anything. I do what I believe in, you know. And so if you are concerned about the state of our country, you just have to get active. I mean, at least vote, and go beyond that if you can. I mean, support candidates that you feel, that are good and you can trust. The stalemate in Congress right now is because the Senate has this 50-50 split. So, I mean, we need to step up and we have some obligations as citizens, and I mean, you can't just live your life like you're in a cocoon. Although sometimes I think the Bay Area is kind of like in a little bubble, but it's a very great bubble. It's a pleasant bubble to be living in, but the rest of the country is not like us. Let's face that. So, you got to pay attention and get involved, at any level. Write postcards, or I don't know, send a few bucks here and there, or write or call your congressperson, or, I mean, these are relatively easy things to do. And I like to get out and march. I like being with a crowd. I have my signs, and I have, I go with friends. And so it just becomes a great feeling to be out on the streets from time to time.
And speaking
Anyway.
up for what we believe in.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Chizu. I really enjoyed being in conversation with you this morning.
Yeah.
And on this occasion of the Cal homecoming.
Okay. Well, it's time for questions, right? Yeah.
Oh, Grace, you're on mute.
Thank you, Chizu. Thank you, Stacy. It was such an enlightening and heartwarming conversation. I just want to say a few words about that film. Not only is it totally beautiful visually, and it gives a lot of information. Chizu and her sister tell their story, but there's something about this film that is full of emotion, and it develops empathy. And it's a wonderful way to hear the story of incarceration and a search for them. It involves their search for the truth. So I highly recommend it, and it's free. And I'm gonna, so we're so lucky to have that film as part of our, I don't know, guiding our culture forward and guiding our activism forward. Even though you say it's old, it's still very relevant. So
thank you, Grace.
We're open now for questions to Chizu, Stacy, or myself. And I'd like to just say, I'd like to say, I'll start with a question for you. You're a 90-year-old activist, 91-year-old activist. This is like, I know that, well, maybe you did. I mean, you did so many different things.
Yeah,
You were part of a lot. You were part of as a young student, you got involved in many, many different ways. You write as an activist, you've done film activists, you demonstrate and march. And
oh, that's right. I write for the JAWAUCB Weekly. Yeah, I've been writing a column there for, I don't know, over 20 years. And fortunately, Kenji, the editor, allows me free reign, and I can say anything I want to. Boy, what a soapbox. I tell you, I've enjoyed doing that for all these years.
And also you write for the International, is it the International Times in Seattle occasionally?
International Examiner, yeah. This and that, yeah.
Have you ever thought of making a collection of all that writing?
No,
Yeah,
I don't even know what I said way back then, but anyway. I might, I'm thinking maybe I'll go through the archives and just see what's there. Yeah.
I think it'd be a really interesting story. And, as Japanese Americans, our voices, we are finally getting a platform now to speak out and to hear our story and beyond our community. And what all that writing you've done is like really important, especially for young people, to learn about the development of yourself and your thinking as a activist. So I want to encourage you to do that. I have another kind of question for you. There may be some young people here who are looking forward to a life of 90 years of activism. So how do you sustain yourself? It's a different kind of question, but how do you sustain yourself?
Well, I don't know. It's curiosity, I guess, because that's, you need to keep your mind active. And, I love movies and documentaries, and I like to cook, and I like to, travel, and I'm lucky in that I have, pretty good health. So that's kind of important, although I never thought about it very much. But also at my age, my peer group is just disappearing. That's a fact of life. And so you kind of have to make younger friends. And so that's, the pandemic has been really awful for everybody, I think, but a lot of it has to do with not being able to be in, with friends and groups and out and about, that kind of thing. So I am really looking forward to being able to go to movies and to go to the opera, or to, whatever, without thinking about it anymore.
Yeah, so you're
Yeah,
talking
it's
about,
been a drag, I'll tell you.
you're talking
Netflix
about,
is only so far, it'll only go so far.
so even as an activist, you have time in your life for fun and to pleasure and social life. So it's,
Always,
always, yeah.
yeah.
You didn't get a chance to talk about Fort Bliss. Chizu, you went to Fort Bliss, what, a couple of months ago?
Yeah, in June, I think it was, we went. Yeah, that's right. Huh? Yeah, Tsuru for Solidarity is the organization that's doing this kind of thing. And originally we were going to have a big march on Washington. Do you remember that? That was the organizing Tsuru in the first place, that we were going to go and demonstrate in front of the White House, or as close as we could get to it, taking our Tsuru, our folded cranes, and taking as many survivors as possible, and to demonstrate our disapproval of immigration, the immigration situation, and the whole asylum program and all that, and the separation of families, and the way children are being cared for at the border. We were going to do all that. Was that in 2019 we were going to go? No, was it 2020?
No, 17.
It was last year, 2020.
My memory is getting so shaky on these things. But anyway, we were going to take everybody in the country that wanted to go on that one. And COVID made it impossible. So now, we're doing smaller demonstrations, but to specific detention centers. That's been our focus anyway. But I do think immigration is something that we just have to deal with. We've put it off and put it off, and it's just going to be an ongoing major problem, until we decide on some legislation that kind of makes it, firm, whatever rules we want to put together in way of legislation.
And maybe even in the same way that Japanese Americans were fighting against the racial discrimination, and to demonstrate their humanity, if we can create and be able to think about immigrant rights in that same humane way. What would be a humane way to be with other
Yes.
communities?
A pathway to citizenship, you know,
Mhm.
particularly for the DACA age group. And
Mhm.
let's face it, we have lots of undocumented immigrants in our country, and it's not fair to anybody that they should be left in this situation where they're always afraid of being caught. You know, that is un-American as far as I'm concerned. We need to straighten it out and form a policy of, you know, giving them their rights and giving them a path to citizenship. I just feel that's extremely important.
We don't want them to go through what Japanese Americans went through to get citizenship, to be incarcerated in mass incarceration. It really points to, that experience points to the injustice of our immigration laws. I mean, it's only the laws that are calling people undocumented. So, yeah.
And also, you know, for people of Muslim faith or who are Arabs and all that, that's also part of the whole equation. But again, it's you know, peoples of color or of different religions, say, you know, and we just need to make up some rules so that it's fair to everybody all around.
So I just, I'm looking for questions. If you have a question and I've missed it, I apologize, but I'm going to double check. Here's the question. This is such a powerful story of your life that you shared. Do you have a word of advice for young people to be involved, active citizens?
Pay attention to the news, I guess you might say. You know, what politicians do has direct impact on your life. I mean, I can't emphasize that more, that they have the power to make changes or undo things or whatever that will affect you directly, like abortion laws or voting rights, or, you know, even the way, you know, the kinds of laws that we have to live under. And so you got to make that connection. And so pay attention, you know, to these people who have that kind of power over our lives, that we need to choose our leaders carefully. You know, what else can I say? It's, you know, every adult has, everybody who is over age 18 now can vote. So, you know, get started early. If you get into the habit of voting, then you will continue to vote. So you start it early. So get the high schoolers and, you know, college kids involved in the political process.
As a former elementary teacher, I think you could even get elementary students involved in the political process. No, you did. But thank you so much. This is going way back to the past, but I hope I can have time for this question. Did your parents know about your activism? Were they still alive when you were doing some of your work? Probably at Cal, but with reparations, and what was their response?
Well, you know, I was a maverick kid anyway, and I think my folks just threw up their hands and said, we can't do anything with this girl, you know, so that they knew early that I would do what I wanted to do, particularly while we were in camp. My folks decided that they had had it with the United States and they were going to go back to Japan. My father was an immigrant, so he was not a citizen of the country. And I fought and kicked and screamed about that. I didn't want to go. And so they knew early on that they could not tell me what to do. Anyway, I mean, and I remember when I first got married, you know, I married a white person, and it was like, oh my God, you know, what everybody said, what's your family going to say about it? And I said, I don't care, and they're not going to say anything because it's what I want to do, you know, sort of thing. So, oh well, anyway, it all worked out very well.
Well, they brought you here to us in this world. And
Anyway, I mean, I understand that I was quite a different kind of kid, but you know, I turned out okay after all. Yeah, my kids are also these feisty types too. So anyway,
you know, Chizu, you are so modest. You keep saying, oh, I wasn't a leader, but you are certainly a spokesperson. You know, your words
yeah,
are important.
no, I
You
think
spoke to the public, you know.
parts of our community are not happy with all with the way I carry on, but anyway,
It's
I'm
okay.
sorry.
You're helping change. You're helping change happen. So, and it's change for justice. And you speak with heart. So I totally appreciate it. So I want to conclude and say thank you, Chizu, and thank you, Stacy.
Oh, I want to say thank you to Berkeley. You know, I mean, it had a lot to do with who I am today.
Oh, that's wonderful. I hope there's some students and parents out there that heard those words. It's always hard for parents to let go of their kids and send them away to UCB. It's so fraught with, there's so many possibilities here in every direction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a great school.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, both of you, Stacy and Chizu, you kept us, you know, in the vernacular woke, you know, and you're pushing us to be involved in social, political, and cultural world today. And I believe that that is part of our legacy as Japanese American women. So I really appreciate that you're here in our conversation to talk with us. And I want to thank the UC alumni for helping us, supporting us with tech. And thank you to the audience. Oops, if you want to find more out about JAWA, you're always invited to go to our website and to join. And our website, I forgot to put it in chat. I'll put it in, is I put it in chat. Come see what we're doing. We're changing our website because we're doing so much more than we were before. But everybody else, goodbye, enjoy homecoming, and go Bears.